Thank you, Virginia. Well, like I said, tonight we're going to be on the law, and just a reminder, if anyone wants to join the group me on the app that's there, where I'll keep you guys updated on the latest. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about interpreting the law. Does anyone know typically what books those are when you refer to the law? Pauline, you're not allowed to answer. Yeah, Genesis to Deuteronomy. So the first 5 books. So just to be crystal clear, what we're talking about today is interpreting these books. Genesis is kind of an asterisk because even though it's considered as part of the books of the law, it's actually mostly narrative, even though there are some laws in Genesis that are interesting, like be fruitful and multiply, and a couple other ones that I think have relevance to Christians significantly, but coming before the law of Moses. But these are the books we're typically talking about. And these are books that, again, I feel like I keep saying this, they do get largely misunderstood, misused. People quote from these. I'm sure you guys have met people who it's like they base their diet off it, certain beliefs they have about God, what they're doing. Some people who kind of come up with some superstitious stuff from time to time. It's interesting. It's usually in one of these books, or just they obey some odd law that they feel like they're obligated to. Some people think I obey it. I don't shave the corners of my beard enough, apparently. So there's great controversy in the church over whether I should be shaved or not, apparently. My wife keeps bringing it up. But anyway, so these are the books that we're talking about when we're talking about interpreting the law. So the first question we're going to ask, because I just won't want to assume that those are the books we talk about, but what exactly is the law? Because the Bible, and especially the New Testament authors, and even the Old Testament authors, just talk about the law a lot. And so it kind of begs the question, well, what law and what exactly are you referring to? And so I think it's a great place for us to start by seeing that really when the Bible refers to the law, it's not always referring to exactly the same thing. Different authors use the law to express things that are similar but not exactly the same. So I think there's basically 3 ways. You could subdivide it into more, but I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. That I think the Bible talks about this idea of the law. What is the law? The first one is it talks about specific commands given by God to Israel. So if you count them up, they're probably about, most people agree, like 600 plus laws that God gives in the Old Testament to Israel of like, this is what you're going to do. This is what you won't do. And it's the laws that often Jesus was like arguing about with the Pharisees and stuff. Their concern was we want to obey every one of these laws, and often the religious leaders of Jesus' times were creating more laws on top of those 600 laws, which frustrated Jesus because essentially they were setting aside the actual law for theirs. But just know there's sometimes, like in Exodus 18:20, even in the Old Testament, it talks about people obeying the law, and these are the commands collectively that God gave to Israel. So sometimes when you see the law, it might be referring to those commands. The second is kind of what we just talked about. Sometimes it's just referring to the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which Virginia mentioned. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it's all, sometimes you'll hear it called the Pentateuch. If you've ever heard that word, you think of penta, like pentagram, 5 points. Penta meaning 5. It just means 5 books. That's all it means. Pentateuch, 5 books, or 5 volumes. So that's how it became to call the Pentateuch. But sometimes in the Bible, both in the New and Old Testament, it's referring to those books. Or if you hear like the Law of Moses, it's usually what it's referring to because most people, including Jesus, seem to believe that Moses was the one who recorded those books and then probably had someone after him because obviously Moses dies in one of those books. So probably someone after him appended it as well, but they're attributed to Moses. And so sometimes they're just referring to the 5 books of the Old Testament, the first 5. And then the third one is, which happens a lot in the New Testament, is really it's referring to the theological and religious system of the Old Testament. So it's talking about the law as this system of ideas or way of doing things. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 9:20. That's where he says, to those under the law, I became as one under the law, talking about his evangelism. And so what he means by that is I sort of entered into their worldview in order to engage them with the gospel. And so just know that as you're reading and anywhere you kind of see the law or the law of Moses, you kind of want to think to yourself, okay, in the context, what makes the most sense? What is the character? What is the author talking about? One of these 3 things, which will help give you some bearing on what they're specifically referring to. So just know that when the Bible talks about the law, it could be referring to any one of those 3. And sometimes it refers to laws plural. It might be talking about number 1, but several of the laws at once. And there's a couple other circumstances. Sometimes it's talking about even the Pharisees' teaching about the law that the Jews often followed. That happens in Acts. But just know there's just 3 senses of which someone could be referring when they talk about the law. Any questions on that? All right. So let's talk about, there's some challenges in interpreting the law, especially for us as modern day readers. Again, I tried to kind of distill them down to something simple. So we're going to go through those. I have 4 of these, 4 or 5. Oh, 5, yeah. But that all comes down to there's a difference between us and what's being written in the law. And the first difference is really, it's a different time, a really different time. I mean, we're talking about when we're reading these first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the setting they're happening in was happening 1400 to 1500 BC. So you're talking about 1500 years before Jesus, and you're talking about 30 or 3,500 years before us. So you can imagine, you guys know how much happens in a week, a month, or 10 years in our country. Now just imagine thousands of years go by. And so we're really separated by quite a significant amount of time, which just brings its challenges of reading something that's literally ancient to us and truly ancient. This thing is, I don't know, however many folds older than even our country has existed. And so we're just reading something ancient. So we're really separated by time, and it's a very different time. The world is different. The landscape is different. Cultures are different. Language is different. The way people think is different. So we just need to know we're separated by a large amount of time, which brings a challenge to interpreting things. We're also separated, or what's different, by culture. Most often people don't think of this as they read the New Testament, but Jewish culture is an Eastern culture, not Western. It's Eastern. It's an ancient Near Eastern culture, and that's the world Israel and the stories we read about are really situated in. And not only that, they're an agrarian society. They're not quite living in cities like we assume them to be cities. There's a time when they're nomads, but people are growing their own food, crops, herding. There's all sorts of things happening that don't function quite like our society. And so when you think about the difference, right? We're not in an ancient culture. We're in a modern culture. We're not in an Eastern culture. We're in a Western culture. We're not an agrarian culture. We're an industrial or even a technological society. And so it's just very different than what we're used to. And so the challenge is to interpret them well. You kind of have to learn something about that ancient world and kind of engulf yourself in it. And even being in the books itself will help you do that. but you kind of have to suspend some of your modern thinking because they're just in a completely different sphere of culture than we are. And so, like, even when we read things, right, and this is an example of how we can kind of read things back. We read about slavery, and everyone immediately thinks of slavery in America. And although both are slavery, they're very different perceptions, very different reasons they happened, very different ways and ways people are treated, how people got in and out of slavery, just very different. So even though it's a familiar concept, because of the separation of culture and time, it's really not, because they just would have conceptualized it as something completely different. I mean, even the thought of slavery, immediately everyone in America is like immoral. Back then, they would have not thought of slavery, or even in the first century, during the time of Christ, that it was inherently immoral in all circumstances, like often Americans or modern persons do. And so, it's just a very different culture, and we're separated by time. Another one is it was a very different language. So I don't know if you guys have ever thought about this. Has anyone ever read 1984 by Orwell? All right, remember his hand? You know how, right, part of that book is the government tries to control the language. And there's kind of a reason for that. This is the thought maybe you've never thought about, but it's true. Language controls the way we think. Based on what you say, what you can say, what you can't say, how you perceive language actually controls the way you think, which is why authors like in 1984, and he's not the only one, knew that if a government tries to control speech and things in certain ways, you can control the way people think, actually, because it controls what perspective they think, what categories exist, and just how we approach things. Like, for example, a couple examples I can think of, right, is ancient Eskimos people, and even today in their language, they have like 100 different ways to talk about snow. Because to them, they're always living in snow and in northern places. And so they talk about snow differently and how they relate to it and all these things. And so the way they just have 1,000 words that we don't have for it. If you go to desert cultures, oftentimes what you find, there's no word for drowning because there's not enough water to drown in. So they have just no concept of that idea. And so it shapes the way they think about water and about these things and swimming and drowning. And there's simple examples, but it's true. So yeah. The way we speak, what we say, matters. A more maybe palpable example that you guys would know is like the abortion debates, right? There's a reason, or even politics, there's a reason why one group wants to be called progressive. It sounds progressive, right? We're moving forward. We're going in the right direction, they're thinking. And some people like to be called conservative because they want to be thought, I'm traditional. I'm what America is about. Or you talk about abortion, I'm pro-life. I'm for life. Or I'm pro-choice. I'm about people having the freedom to make their choices. And so those labels are very specific. People use them on purpose. And oftentimes, as I've even engaged people on abortion, my old church, we used to go out regularly to do this. It was very important. I taught students, and me and the other pastor, other adults, we taught the language you use about this matters, because people don't want to say this is a human. It's just a clump of cells. They don't want to say there's a difference between saying I'm anti-abortion and I'm for life, or there's a difference between saying I'm anti-abortion and I'm for the abolition of abortion. They mean different things. And so it really matters how we talked about the issue, our vocabulary and these things. So language shapes the way we think. The original language of the Old Testament is Hebrew, and it certainly shaped the way they thought, the way they formulated thoughts, the way things got written down and why they are. And so sometimes to us, we'll read it in English like, that's peculiar. Or even the way it's organized. As you read some of the law, you're like, it just seems so random. There's a law here, and then this law, and then this law. Like, why is it organized? But to them, that would have been like, this makes sense why it's organized this way. And we'll get into some of that today. 4, it's a different covenant. So if you don't know, when it comes, I think we went over this in one class towards the beginning, but Old Testament, New Testament, the Testament is really just another word for covenant. So the Old Testament is the books that what is happening in the books is under the old covenants. Well, mostly. The old covenant doesn't happen till Exodus, so part of Genesis isn't quite there yet. And what is happening in the New Testament is under the new covenant. And why that's significant, in short, is it changes the dynamic between God's people and him. God changes how he relates to people based on these covenants. And so there's an old covenant and there's a new covenant. There's an Old Testament and a New Testament. So as we read it back, we're new covenant people as the church and as Christians, but we're reading about the old covenant people, and we're reading about their relationship to God, which is actually different than the way we relate to God in some regards. There's some ways it's similar, but a lot of ways that it's different. So different covenant. Lastly, there are different peoples, meaning, interestingly, right, most of the Old Covenant in the Old Testament is specifically for Israel, which is both a religious group and an ethnic group. But for us in the church today, as Christians of the New Covenant, the church is filled with mostly Gentiles, non-Jewish people, which brings a whole new mixing because we're from different cultures, different backgrounds, versus they would have shared a very common narrative about who they are, where they came from. And we do too as Christians because we're in Christ, but we also share very different narratives of our languages, where we've lived, where we've been, our experiences. They would have shared a lot more in common. So it's important to just realize that as we think about the law. Any questions about those differences, challenges, Hilda?
Not a question, just a comment.
Mm-hmm.
That these 5 things, for me, it makes it even more amazing that we have the Bible, you know,
Yeah.
and that we know all of those things that you just pointed out. It's like, how will we know about that?
Yeah.
Because we had it, all those records and that are still here.
It's amazing that God protected his word as faithfully as he has over basically 3,500 years. That what we have today is almost 99.9% identical to what they had. And we could even read the original language. That's amazing too. There was a time when Hebrew almost died out as a language and was revived by some faithful people. And so the learning came back and the scholarship for that. So it is really cool that we have these things and be able to understand. Otherwise, it might be a lot harder for the church to understand these things. Any other comments, questions?
Did this really start with Moses? Was there much of a law prior to Moses?
There's some. God gives certainly some commands, but specifically when the Bible talks about the law, not really until Moses. That reminds me of what I was going to make the comments on the people group. It gets sort of lost on us, but right, God says from Abraham, I'm going to make you into this nation and into this people group, and eventually we get to the end of Genesis and his family, of which is probably several hundred people at that point, but by no means a nation, goes into Egypt, and then they're there for 400 years, and then they multiply into several hundreds of thousands of people over about 400 years. The power of exponential things happening. But it's hard for us to imagine how significant it was as Israel comes out of Egypt that God really constitutes them then into a nation and a people. And just how crazy that was in the world of happening. Of like, I'm pulling you out of this other nation and I'm making you into a nation and another people group that's different than all the other people groups of the earth. That really did start with Moses and the Exodus of when God fulfills that promise to make Abraham's people into truly a nation. That's when that begins. But before that, when you read Romans and things like that, Paul seems to make that point clear. Before Moses, there wasn't a law in this sense, even though certainly there was commands and people knew some of what God desired. So, any other questions, comments? Let's go on then. So what's the purpose of the law? I think this is an important question. We ask of why did God give the law? What's the purpose of the law before we get into actually what are the principles for interpreting it? What do you all think? I think you guys can probably get most of these. I wrote down, again, 5. 5's just the number today. But what are some of the purposes the Bible talks about? Why was the law given? Anyone want to take a stab at one? Yeah, so they know how to respond to God, so they know how to live before God. This is God's expectations for you and how to live and how to be a nation and how to conduct yourself. So yeah, that's probably the clear example. That's why laws exist in our country. Here's their expectation as a citizen of this country, that we expect you to live this way, otherwise suffer the consequences. What else?
Relationships between God and men, God and people.
Yeah, so defining the relationship, which is similar to the expectations, right? Of this is a relationship, this is how it's gonna play out. Why else? Yeah, so one of them might be to prove that man was lost. I put to expose man's sin. So the New Testament talks about that. So I think that's one purpose. Robert?
It was to point us to the coming Messiah.
Yeah, so the law was to expose our sin, and as Galatians says, it was like a guardian over us. It showed us that we were really sinners, so then we're like, how do I get out of this sin? Like, I'm just always stuck in it. I'm always having to make it. The Jewish people were like, I'm always having to go make sacrifices again and again and again, and I can't stop sinning. And when will this come to an end? It makes us anticipate Christ. Good. Anyone else? Yeah, that's what I was referring to. Our tutor, our guardian, depends what translation you're reading. Our schoolmaster in some. If Sean was here, I'd ask him what KJV says. I bet you it says schoolmaster or something like that. But he'll probably be in. Yeah.
It also served as to mediate God's law to the other nations surrounding.
Mm-hmm.
To show it's holy before those nations.
Yeah. So it says something about who God is and his character, not only to Israel, but to the surrounding nations. That was another thing that's really unique. We kind of just pass over is the Jewish people, God tells them, you'll be a kingdom of priests. And in the ancient world, that was unheard of. Like, you go to another people group, they worship a God, and you're like, who's your priest? Who's the head honcho around here? Who does the religious stuff? Oh, it's this guy. He's, special and elevated. But to the Israelite, they're like, who's your priest? And they had priests, they had a high priest, but it was also like all of us. And they would have been like, all of you? You're all priests? Yeah. So, and it's similar. The New Testament relates the same to us, that there's a sense in which even believers are all priests in sense, which is one of the reasons, to be quite honest, that I'm not Catholic. Because my conviction is, first of all, we have a high priest in heaven at the right hand of God, who's better than any other man. But second of all, there's a sense in which, because we're all priests as Christians, we can intercede on behalf of any other Christian. That's what intercession is, or that's what supplication is, when we intercede on behalf of another believer. And then ultimately, as we pray, the true and fullest interceder, Christ, intercedes on their behalf as we pray. But we get to do that. And so there's a sense in which we don't need a specific priest. You guys can pray for someone just as much as I can as your pastor and intercede and for them. So I think you guys hit them all. So we'll just go through them quick. But the first one is to reveal the character of God, both to Israel and the surrounding nations. You see that in those verses. But it says something about who God is when he gives these laws. It's a reflection of who he is. 2, to provide instruction for living rightly. This is what God expects, how you expect Israel to live their life, and to do it in a way that is not sinning and, in fact, right or righteous before God. To keep the people of God distinct was one as well. That a lot of the laws that God gives for Israel might seem odd to us, like, why no bacon? Why no shellfish? Like, why these animals and not these animals? Much of the time, the reasoning behind that was God wanted them to be very distinct and different from the surrounding nations. And the surrounding nations ate these things or did these rituals or whatever it may be. So he gave them something very different. So when the world would look at them like, wow, you're really peculiar people and your God's really peculiar and unique. And the Jews, faithless as they were many times, really held on to that significantly, particularly once they came out of the exile of Babylon. Since then, for, I don't know exactly when that would be in BC, but for thousands of years since then, that really seemed to got the Jews rid of sort of idolatry. There's other faithless ways they would continue, but they would really be distinct from then on. And to this day, you meet Jewish people. If you go to Israel, Trisha was there recently. There's different sects, but they are a peculiar people, that's for sure. So yeah, if you see those guys with the curls, going down, it's because they don't shave the corners of their beard, so they got the curls. Yeah, there's other reasons too, but the long locks, yes. Hasidic Jews. You'll see them in New York City too. To secure covenant blessing. So many times God gave the law. I said, look, you want to enjoy the blessing I'm giving you? Then here it is. If you do this and obey, I will bless you. If you do this and disobey, I will curse you and be against you. And so it laid out, if you want to secure covenant blessing, this is what it is. And it's important for us to understand when it comes to covenants. Covenants, again, separated by time and culture, aren't something really people practice anymore, but it was very common in ancient Near East. Like, even as other people heard about Abraham's covenant and God's covenant through Moses, which the law itself was a type of covenant, other people groups would have understood what that meant. And the short of it is, it was common in the ancient Near Eastern world that there was sort of a leader or a king who would make a covenant with a people and say, if you obey my laws and have covenant loyalty, I will grant you protection and bless you, and I will give you these things so long as you stay loyal. And so when God made a covenant, Israel would have known and understood what a covenant was. And that's why many of the stipulations are that. God says, I'll protect you, I'll provide for you, I'll do all these things for you. But if you're not loyal, then you're not going to enjoy you're not going to enjoy the benefit of this, which often happens to Israel. He never abandons Israel or gives up his promise, but he does discipline them. And he also gives them consequences. You can forfeit the enjoyment of this blessing, even though it's a genuine promise to you. So it was also to secure covenant blessing. And lastly, it was to expose human sin. And as we get to the New Testament, Paul and James talk about that the law was given to show that nobody was ultimately going to be made right with God by just obeying the law all the time, and to set them up well for the coming of Christ, because even in the sacrifices, they were constantly remembering that they were deserving of death because of their sin. But God was gracious and merciful to them. But it was also expose human sin. Questions? Thoughts? Anything from that? All right, if you think of any, feel free. So key principles for interpreting the law that I think will be helpful for you guys as you read these books. The first one, which is like, it's up there. This is like star it, asterisk, highlight it. Interpret the law alongside the narrative context. Notice as you read these books, besides law, what you see on both sides of them is stories. Stories on both sides, and that happen in between. You can't interpret the law properly unless you understand the stories. And so in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, alongside the law, you have these stories. and understanding the law is being given in the context of the story that's unfolding between God and Israel, which is just really, really, really important. And so even the example I gave earlier, understanding a little bit, okay, there's these Canaanite nations around Israel that are sacrificing their children, worshiping demonic entities that are disguised as gods, have certain diets, all these things. God's bringing judgment on them. Helps us to understand why the law was given about the food and some of the clothing and the way they ought to live. Some of these things to us that seem trivial, but when you understand them in the context of the narrative, you're like, oh, that really makes sense. And even today, as Christians, right, we want to stand out from the world in some sense. And I think there's ways we do that in our context in San Antonio in America. And there's ways that other Christians do that in a very different way, in a very, very different country. But the principle is that we stand out as distinct, but based on what our story is, where we grew up, the culture we're in, the experiences we're having, help us to understand, how do I take the principle God is teaching and apply it? And for Israel, they were in a very particular circumstance. So, and we come to understand that circumstance when we come to understand the narrative that God has passed on to us with it. That's part of the reason why the stories are there with the law. So don't try to divorce, and this is sometimes where a lot of modern Christians get confused with the diet and stuff. They try to divorce some verse or some law. I would even say the Ten Commandments from the narrative story, and they try to isolate it, and they try to make it into this weird new Christian thing that's very confusing. And then you start asking, well, why that law and not this law? Like, you want to eat with this special diet, but I don't see you owning any slaves or promoting that. Or like, you won't eat this food, but you sure as heck like bacon, or whatever it may be. Or some people get into the clothing and stuff, like you don't want to wear clothing with two different textiles in it, so you only wear one. That was one of the laws for Israel. And it just gets real weird real quick. I think they're divorcing it from its narrative context. There's another thing they're doing that we'll get to that's, I don't think, good either. Number two, interpret the law according to its covenant nature. The law was given as a covenant. And so we just have to understand that the law was made in the context of a covenant, which is why there's blessings and cursings, promises from God, promises from the people. So just, again, kind of similar, just don't divorce it from this idea of covenant. Whenever you think of law, think covenant, because that's how Jewish people would have thought. They would have thought law equals covenant. Which is why even as we read the New Testament, when we read, maybe you read about the Pharisees and you think, oh, they were so bad and da-da-da. To the average person, they were the heroes because they were the people protecting the people from covenant unfaithfulness. So they're saying, this guy knows the Old Testament, he knows it, and he's protecting us from doing the wrong thing so God doesn't curse us. And so to them, they were the heroes. We just think of them as the bad guys. And that's how they viewed themselves. We're protecting the people from covenant unfaithfulness. And so it just gives us a different perspective. But know that those two things always go together, covenant and law. And even as we receive the new covenant as Christians, Paul refers to the law of Christ. The new covenant doesn't come without laws. There are expectations that Jesus has for us of obedience. Is our salvation based off that? No, in one sense, we're saved by faith in Christ, by God's grace. But in another sense, if we don't obey his law, Jesus and Paul basically say there's no confidence to believe that you have actually had faith or trust because you don't obey. One of my favorite verses is John 3:36. It says, we could just open up there, but I think it puts it so well when it talks about, it's Jesus preaching, and it's near John 3:16, and we all know that verse. But this is a great verse for people to know. Jesus says, "Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him." And you see right there, even Jesus himself puts belief and obedience side by side. Where there is no faith, there is no obedience. And when there is no obedience, there's no faith. Or you could put it in the positive. Where there's faith, genuine faith, there is genuine obedience. Where there's genuine obedience, there must be genuine faith. And so we interpret the law according to its covenant nature. Number 3, interpret the law in relation specifically to the old covenant. It's a different covenant than the new one. It's got different laws. It's for a different people and a different context. And so we interpret the law in relation to the old covenant. So I think this is especially important for Christians because we're not under the old covenant, we're under the new. And so as you read the Bible, for example, I think it's Galatians chapter 3. See if I can find it. I think it's Galatians 3:16, but let me see if I can find it real quick. For those of you who grew up listening to those Bible songs when you were a kid and you know the books of the Bible, I wish I were you, because I still get some of the epistles confused in my mind in what order they're in. But Galatians 3, Paul says in verse 13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hanged on a tree, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promise by faith. And even earlier, verse 10, to skip a little earlier, I should have started here. For all who rely on works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. Verse 11, now it is evident no one is justified before God by the law. The righteous shall live by faith. But right, as Christians, we're not under the law of the old covenant. We're just not. And so I'm going to say something that's going to startle some of you at first, but might make some sense. Because people will ask me about this as a pastor. We'll get into conversations about things like the 10 Commandments. And I'll tell you guys, as a new covenant believer, I don't think we're under even the 10 Commandments, because this was part of the old covenant. However, when you think about it, and what Christ teaches in the New Testament and the apostles, 9 of those 10 commandments get reiterated in some form under the new covenant. Does anyone know which is the one, besides Sean, because I think we've talked about it, doesn't get reiterated under the new covenant? The Sabbath, right? And there's some sense where the Sabbath is still mentioned in Hebrews, but it's an eternal Sabbath, the Sabbath that we enter into. But there is no more Sabbath. So even as Christians, when I cringe inside a little bit, but I don't want to go around correcting everyone. When they say Sunday, the Sabbath day, I'm like, it's not a Sabbath day. Or if I talk to a Seventh-day Adventist, who they're about worshiping on Saturday because that was the original Sabbath day, I'd say that Sabbath has passed away. Me and Michael were talking about types before, right? The Sabbath was a type of something that was going to happen later. It was meant to show there was rest that was going to happen. And now we have that eternal rest, and Christ rests in some sense from doing our works, the Bible says, because we no longer have to do that to sort of justify ourselves or to receive the blessing. But they get reiterated in Christ's law, and even in a stricter sense, right? Because no longer is it about, you can't just do it on the exterior. Christ says on the interior, you can't do it. It's not that you just can't murder someone. You can't hate them in your heart. And so the new covenant law, and this is how it differs a lot of times from the old covenant law, it not only looks on the outside, it looks on the inside and turns toward the heart. And there's some sense in which the old covenant law was meant to do that as well, as we'll see. But I would argue it certainly, I don't think, was as clear or as explicit as it is under the new covenant. And that's because under the new covenant, we're given a new heart. We have the Spirit of God now living inside of us. That wasn't something that old covenant believers had. They had the Spirit working on them if they were truly believers and trusters in God's promises, but he wasn't living inside of them. He wasn't actively there. And so that's also different for us under the new covenant. But we're new covenant believers, and so we're subjected to Christ's law. And Christ's law is essentially what Christ teaches in the New Testament and what his apostles have passed on to us in these books. And so, so I don't really recognize a Sabbath day. And then sometimes Christians get themselves in other trouble, or I'm not even a big proponent. I think this was a big debate in Texas a while ago, right? Having the 10 Commandments outside some courthouse, something. And I'm like, it's kind of in one sense, I'm like, it's kind of like a cool historical thing to think about. But I'm like, certainly people who aren't even Christians aren't necessarily under this law in that sense. But even as Christians, as the church, I don't think personally we're technically under the 10 Commandments, but it kind of seems like we are because we follow about 9 of them, maybe even more faithfully than an Israelite might have. What's that?
Chick-fil-A follows all.
Chick-fil-A what?
Chick-fil-A follows all of them.
Oh, Chick-fil-A follows all of them. How about that? But yeah, and I'm not worried about eating kosher. I'm good with eating bacon and other things, seafood, shellfish. Yeah.
Maybe a good way to think about it, you say we're not under the commandments, we're not under the law. Somebody might mistakenly think you're saying we don't have to do those things,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I know you're not saying that.
Yeah.
So it would probably be a good idea because usually when somebody questions that, most of the time, it's somebody that's not familiar with the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not a Christian. I've had non-believers argue with me about things. They'll say something like, "Do you like oysters?" And I go, "Yeah." Well, you're breaking the very Bible that you claim you believe in.
Yeah.
They'll use things like that.
That's where you just pull a verse.
That they have no understanding.
Yeah. They're not taking into account the things we mentioned, right? Culture, time, covenant, difference. They're just pulling verses out. And in their defense, they've probably met a lot of Christians who do that. So they think that's what Christians do. You just whip out Bible verses and throw them in my face without, actually giving me some sense of understanding of what the Bible is. And that's why, if y'all notice, even when I preach, I don't always assume everyone's churched and knows the language and the history. And there's some things that are really simple that I try to explain, even opening up the Bible of like the big numbers of chapters, the little numbers of verses. Someone might not even know where a book is, or it's just simple things like that. But yeah, it's true. And that's why for me, personally too, as I engage in a conversation with Christians or non-Christians, I'm like, yeah, in my mind, I don't have to play that little game of which Old Testament law I got to obey and which not. Because I'm like, I'm just not under the law. So it's easy. I'm under a law, Christ's law, but it's not the Old Testament. So as I engage in non-belief, that's what I say. Well, something along the lines of like, maybe other Christians have confused you or your experience has, and then explain a little bit of that context of, hey, this was an old covenant that was for a different people group, for a different time. But actually, as Christians, we believe we're under a new covenant, and God has changed the terms in which he relates to his people, which came with a new law. And so that's why there are things that I do follow. And it can seem very similar to the 10 Commandments because you'd expect that. Same God, you'd expect some continuity, similarity from one law to the next. But they're not exactly the same. Hilda?
I was thinking of, I think it's 1 Corinthians, where he says that the epistles of Christ are written on the fleshy tablets of our heart.
Yeah.
So,
Such a great line. Comparing to Moses, right? Moses wrote on these tablets of stone, and now he's saying, God's made you new. He's written his law on your fleshy heart and given you the Spirit to be able to carry out that law. What a wonderful promise that we have, and a great thing. And then, number 4, interpret the law according to its type. And what I mean is, there's different types of laws, and this is the next kind of slides we'll get into. There's the Apodictic law, which is a fancy way of saying this straightforward you will and you won't laws. And I should have looked up how to pronounce this word, because at first I thought it was Casuistic. Maybe that's what it is. Somebody look it up. How do you actually? But I think it's Casuistic. Virginia would know. English teacher in our midst. Look it up. Look it up so we can all. I meant to look it up before class and forgot. But she'll look up the hyphenetic pronunciation. So we'll look at some people divided into those two categories, which I think is helpful. The second one just sort of means like in the case of, or when this happens. If this happens, then this happens. This is what you should do. And then some people will also break it up into three categories: civil, ceremonial, and moral. The Bible doesn't necessarily break them up like that, but it's just kind of helpful that some laws are civil. They have to do with the governing of the land and sort of things that happen between people. They're ceremonial. This is what will happen in religious worship and in the temple and the laws that God gives. And then moral. This is how I expect you to behave and to act and treat one another and these things. And so we're going to look at those categories. What do we have, Virginia? Can you find it?
Well, Google AI says casuistic.
Casuistic. There we go. Casuistic. I'll stick with that. But let's, and one more. Interpret the law as God's word. No, even though you're not under the gold covenant, it's still God's law. It's not to you, but it's still for you, and we can benefit from it as Christians. At the very least, as we've already pointed out, it shows that we were unrighteous. It was through the law, whether it was explicitly in the Bible or as Paul talks about in Romans. There's a sense in which even without the Bible, everyone has the law of God written in their heart because they have a conscience. Every person who's ever lived in every culture has a conscience, and they can choose to obey their conscience or to go against their conscience or to excuse their conscience. And even if their conscience is misinformed, it tells them something, you can do this, and it's not wrong, but it is wrong. Or even if their conscience says, don't do this, but they do it anyway. Even if it's misinformed, it just shows that there's a voice in their head saying, don't do this or do this, and they do it anyway. And so Paul uses that point in Romans 3 to say, and that's why people who are not even Jewish, who never had the Old Testament or anything, also know that they're sinners because God's law, in some sense, has been written on their hearts. Israel was held to a higher accountability because they had more revelation, more given from God, the covenants, the promises, and Paul talks about that in Romans as well, that it was very beneficial to be a Jew. But it's not as if you could just make the excuse, well, God, how could you hold me guilty of sin? I didn't have all those promises of the Jewish people and all those things. You had a God-given conscience, and you went against that. You knew what was right, and you didn't do it. You knew at times it was wrong, and you did it anyway. You violated your God-given conscience, and so you too are a sinner. That's a great tool in evangelism, by the way, appeal to people's conscience. I often tell people, I think you know that you're a sinner. I think you know that you do wrong. And most people know. Nobody outright comes. They might say, I'm a good person, but hardly anyone says they're a perfect person. And so usually, many times, and if you guys are familiar with even Ray Comfort, that's what he does. He says, well, he asks some questions like, you ever hated anybody in your heart? Well, Christ talks about that as murder. You ever stolen from anybody? What do you call somebody who steals something even once? Well, you're a thief, even if it happened once. You ever told a lie? Yeah. Well, what do you call people who tell even one lie? A liar? Yeah. So you're telling me you're a thieving, liar, adulterer, and you're a good person? And it really people are like, whoa, like, I never thought of it that way.
I've looked at a lot of those Ray Comfort videos, and sometimes they say, so when you call somebody who tells a lie, are you human?
Yeah. But to that point, I'd say great. And you think that because, right, we're all sinners, and you intuitively understand that, even without a Bible, that you're messed up, I'm messed up, the world's messed up. That's another thing I ask people is a great way to start an evangelism conversation. Do you think something's wrong with the world? Everyone does. We just disagree on what it is. But hardly anyone says, yeah, the world's all as it should be. and asking questions like, where do you get the idea of should or ought? What standard do you compare to of the way things ought to be? You're an atheist. What does that mean? Things ought to be different. In your worldview, we came from nothing, we're going nowhere, and we are insignificant. So asking them questions like, what do you mean the world's not how it should be? Who cares how human beings treat each other according to your worldview? Because eventually we'll just die out and the universe will get cold. No one's going to be around to remember us, good or bad. You're Ecclesiastes without no hope. So, yeah. Any other questions, thoughts about these? Okay, let's get into explaining the bottom asterisk a little bit. So,
I was thinking that there's no like discrepancy between the Ten Commandments and what we find with Jesus in the New Testament.
yeah.
Because when he said, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it.
Mm-hmm.
And when he taught them, he said, you were told this so and so, but I tell you,
Mm-hmm.
he was pointing out to the very heart of the law.
Yep.
He was more interested in this new covenant in who we are from the work of the Holy Spirit more than just following the rules.
Yeah. And I think Jesus was doing something even more significant. So to what Monica's pointing to you guys, right, is kind of the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain. If you're reading the Gospel of Luke, they're probably two different circumstances where he taught the same thing to two different people. But right, there's different views on what the Sermon on the Mount is, and what Jesus was doing. So me and Sean were talking about this after class the other day. So a question is, was he just saying always what the Old Testament law was intended to be? That's one option. The second option is, was Jesus really just establishing a whole new law? He was not only saying that the law intended this, but he's saying, here's a whole new law. There's other views that people have. They don't even think it's for Christians, that he's just teaching Jewish people. There's kind of different views on the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus is doing there in his teaching. But nevertheless, one of the first two views, I land on the second one, but I think they're both can be had biblically. But I think Jesus was going even one step further. I think he was not just saying, hey, this is what the Old Testament law intended, as much as he was saying, this is going to be a new covenant, and this is a new thing I'm doing, and this is for citizens of the kingdom under that covenant. This is how you live as citizens of the kingdom. You can't just not murder, not do these things. You have to Monica's point, from the inside out, love the Lord with everything that you have. And so I think he was just establishing a whole new law for a whole new covenant. But just know, you hear different preachers. They might preach the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, a little differently. And it really does matter as a preacher. You kind of got to figure out, how do I interpret this? How do I take this? What is Jesus doing exactly? But yeah. Apodictic and what did we say? Casuistic. That's going to trip me up. Apodictic simply means an apodictic law is a direct command that says what must or must not be done. So an example is, you read a lot of those commands that fall into this category. It's you shall not or you shall. We think of the 10 Commandments. You shall not this, you shall not this, you shall not this. We'll actually look at an example together, but it's a fancy way of just saying that. Apodictic is this idea of direct communication. It's just telling someone how it is. And so God's just saying, this is how it is, this is what you won't do, this is what you will do. And so this has been a helpful category for people as they've read the Bible to think about some of the laws. A second one is casuistic. is case-based law that explains what should happen in a specific situation. Example, whenever you sort of read if-then statements, if X happens, then you shall do Y. And so kind of the difference between them largely is sort of apodictic is sort of this universal thing happening where often God gives a specific example, but it's sort of meant to be universal. It's for all people at all times. This is what you do. This is what I want from you. It's more direct. God often accompanies it with an example, though. And casuistic is more, hey, if you find yourself in this specific circumstance, this is how I want you to respond, or in this situation. So we see some of those laws as well. Yeah.
Could casuistic be a cause-based law?
That's kind of what it is. I mean, I'm sure they come from the same root word. Circumstance, cause, situation. I didn't know what word to use, so I landed on situation for now. But yeah, the idea is sort of you could use conditions too. Like certain conditions have to be met to make sense to obey this law. But if you never find yourself in this situation, then it may not be relevant for you. But like I said, we'll get into some examples, and I think that will help. This is just the three other categories. Sometimes you'll hear theologians and people separate them into civil, laws governing society, courts, and national life; ceremonial, laws about worship, sacrifices, purity, and religious rituals; moral, laws that teach what is right and wrong morally. So even as you hear some people teach, they'll kind of teach Jesus fulfilled all of these things. He did them perfectly. He obeyed all the civil laws, the ceremonial laws, and the moral law perfectly, like nobody had before, and fulfilled all of them in that sense. Which is why as Christians, we depend on Christ. He's the fulfillment of these laws on our behalf, and we're credited his righteousness. But to get back into an example, someone want to read this for us, and then we'll ask, which kind of law is this, and why do you think that? But so anyone can go ahead and just read.
When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare. Neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God.
You can keep going. Next one.
You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord.
So what do you guys think? What type of law is being given here? Apodictic, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's given. And then what are some clues that we know that? You shall not is in there a lot. What else? What's something that's interesting that's repeated over and over again? I am the Lord, right? It has this idea of this is God's character. There's some universal principle happening here. God's rooting it in who he is. I am the Lord. You shall and shall not do these things. So yeah, I think those are the two biggest indications that it is. And like all these things are connected. Notice God gives a specific example, which we'll get to that in a minute, of, hey, well, what if I don't fall under this specific example? What does that mean for me? What if I'm a farmer and I don't grow grapes? What if I grow olives? What if I grow some other crop? Do I not have to obey this law then? Because I don't technically do that. I think that's something, the type of thing the Pharisees were doing. But we'll see why Jesus criticized for them, because they missed it. They were looking a little too hard, not at the hearts, and not understanding that the law is a word we'll go over later. But notice there's an example, and then some specific things tied to that, right? So this is example, and this second paragraph kind of fills out Why? You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by your name falsely, so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You could imagine there's people working in these fields doing things. There's already this implication. Like, you're not going to rip people off and workers who are working for you, all these things. The wages of the hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. If you were blind or deaf in those times, you were a poor person. So kind of the connection, part of the connection, right, is you don't strip your whole vineyard or whatever you may be farming because you leave it for those in the covenant who are dependent on that for their position because they can't work or do what you're doing. And so it was meant to leave there. Interesting thing, even as I was reading Mark to my son this week, right? Jesus and his disciples, there they are picking grains on the Sabbath. That's what they were doing, right? The disciples and him were poor. They had no home, no nothing. Just the ladies with them who were paying sometimes out of their own purse to help them out, following them around. But they were the poor gleaning from those fields. The Pharisees did not take it so much trouble with that. They were, from our perspective, freeloading off sort of just picking the grains and doing things. But the trouble was you can't do it on the Sabbath because that's work. They missed something here about God's provision for the poor and the needy, and that they had to eat. And Jesus corrects them about that. But yeah, so that's an example of that. So apodictic law is universal, setting a universal standard by direct command. By direct command. You shall and shall not do this. And then there's this one, which you guys can guess is the other one. But can someone read it for us? Someone else?
If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you today, do this today. But if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he is well off with you, then you shall take an awl and put it through his ear to the door, and he shall be your slave forever. And to your female slave you shall do the same.
Yeah. That's right. This is an example of not everyone owned a slave. Not everyone was a slave, but slavery was a part of the culture, and it was under God's law. People got into slavery for different reasons. Some people just sold themselves into slavery because that's the only way they could pay their debt or get work. Or some people, as the example it gives in this, actually enjoyed the benefits of being a slave to their master, so much so that when they had their opportunity for freedom, they said, I don't want to go. I like you as my boss. I like you and my family here. Like, I want to be yours forever. And God said, all right, you take them to the door, stick an earring in that thing, and that would make a sign that they're theirs, yours forever. And many times in the ancient world, slaves were sometimes treated very badly. Other times in different cultures, they were a part of the family. Even in Roman society, when Jesus came on the scene, again, there were some people who sold themselves into slavery purposely and stayed there. There were doctors, lawyers, all sorts of professionals and people because they basically now had a sponsor who would pay all their expenses. And so they gladly sold themselves there. But on the other side of that, there were other times sometimes people got hit, with really bad poverty. Famine came into the land, and so they had to sell themselves into some sort of servitude to be able to eat and provide for themselves. There's other times where people were prisoners of war and were made into servants and slaves. So to us, it sounds crazy. People read the Old Testament like, see, God's for slavery. But the astonishing thing is, like, this was unheard of in the ancient world. And even as you read the rest of the Bible, the slave is made in the image of God, just like you are. Like the book of Job, Job says, God considers me and the slave just the same, and compares the two in the sense of that they're both made in the image of God. And even the idea of sort of regulating it would have been crazy. And this idea, like, you have to free them after so many years. And not only do you free them, you supply them liberally with all they need from your own supply. Like, you go above and beyond. Like, this was a very different way of dealing. So you could imagine, even in these dealings, how different Israel was. And so it was known amongst Israel they weren't supposed to have anybody for more than 7 years. And even later, Moses will give a law that every 50 years, every slave was to be free. That every 50 years, every slave, no matter who they were, was to be set free. And it didn't matter if they became a slave 40 years ago or yesterday. They were supposed to set them all free in the year of Jubilee. And so it was a very, very different culture. The thing I think I find fascinating that goes against our American minds is even you get to the New Testament, Paul still speaks to slaves. And I think part of that is not because Paul thought or Jesus thought slavery was so moral as much as it is just reality. You live in the Roman Empire, you're a Christian who's a slave, you ain't getting free anytime soon. Like, how do I actually live in the situation I'm in? And I think Paul was trying to address them. Well, this is how you live. Like, if you can get free, Paul tells them, buy your freedom. But so long as you're a slave, this is how you serve the Lord, even in the circumstance you find yourself. But what I find fascinating is more than outright coming out with the abolition, so to speak, Jesus and Paul use slavery as their most common analogy to our relationship to Christ. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I'll be careful when I say this, right? But there's some sense, and one of my professors said this one time as he was preaching to Corinthians, and I was like, oh, that is a crazy thought I've never thought of. That must mean, as Christians, we have to admit that not all slavery is inherently immoral. Because if we're slaves of Christ, that's not an immoral relationship. There's not something wrong with it. So, not all that to say, I don't want to go back to what America was, because that was slavery based on race, people treated badly, not in the image of God, nor do I even necessarily would want to go to this. I'm glad slavery is abolished. But there's some sense in which we're slaves of Christ and slaves of righteousness. And I'm like, oh, that is a wild thought to think that there's some place for that in the Christian worldview where it's not all just negative like we typically think of. Robert, Hilda?
So, sometimes I get discussions about people will say the Bible supports slavery. And, there's descriptive and prescriptive.
Mm-hmm.
So when the Bible's talking about slavery, it's describing that slavery existed. But I have yet to find, I think, a scripture that where God is telling man, make slaves of others.
Mm-hmm.
He's not commanding man.
And even in the Old Testament law, he says you can do that in some circumstances to the Israelites, to be fair. But he never tells them you must do that or you should do that. He tells them there's times the people who I commanded you to destroy because of wickedness might sort of repent or make peace, and you can make them into servants and spare their life. But he doesn't say you have to do that. So, yeah. Sean?
Well, I was going to say, so, because I've had those conversations too. And they're like, oh, you support slavery. All of us support slavery. The prison system is a slavery system. So,
there's forms of slavery everywhere.
Yeah, so we as a society agree that if we think someone is doing something egregious enough, we are going to take their liberty away and put them into slavery. And,
Yeah.
Hopefully they repent, and hopefully our system is designed to get them to come back to society and be helpful. But we all condone slavery because we have a very large prison system, especially here in the United States.
Yeah. Some people would say earned slavery, maybe, but yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of systems. Imagine the astonishment. What if somebody tells you that next time and you say, I agree with you. Bible does support slavery, just not the slavery you're thinking of. And then you can get into a conversation. But even historically, like, people just assume you say slavery in one place, like almost every culture and everywhere had slavery, and it was different there were similarities, but there's differences in those two. And so, like, the time of Jesus, like, really, ethnic slavery wasn't much a thing unless you happen to be a conquered peoples by the Romans. It much more had to do were you conquered by the Romans, they didn't care what your skin color was or what your name was or what your language was, or were you impoverished, or did you want sort of opportunity that only, enslaving yourself would get you sort of ahead in society. So I think when we got to there in Ephesians, if you want to go back, when I preached on Paul's words to slaves, I kind of talked a little bit about, hey, there's similarities and there's differences. And so in ancient Roman culture, some slaves had a great life. Some of them had a horrible life, were treated even worse than what happened in America. But it usually wasn't because of their skin color. It was for other reasons, and mostly because whoever owned them was a horrible person. And some slave owners were very kind and very gracious and provided for their slaves and cared for them well. So much so, similar circumstances happened here. They didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay.
And even with poverty still, if you don't pay your taxes long enough, the government will come and get you.
They'll put you in prison. That's true. Yeah, you'll have consequences.
We're in that same state where, like, slavery's kind of.
And there's just plenty of countries where outright slavery just does exist in what we think of, and forced labor and people groups conquering other people groups. So it still happens, and over almost every nation's had it. But again, I think we said in this in another class, nuance is not something people do well these days. They just want to slap a label on something and say, this is what it always is all the time, with no gray area. And I'm like, do you live in real life? Most of real life is gray. I'm saying that even as a Christian, that yes, the most important things are black and white, but there's a whole lot of gray. That's why we got books like the wisdom literature that we'll get to later, because that's where we live most of our life, actually, in gray, not in black and white. So yeah. But people don't like to talk or think much about the gray. They want to live in the black and the whites, even non-believers. Killed it?
Just a couple of points. Somebody might have said this already, but there's still slavery all over the world.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Bad slavery.
Yeah.
And Sunday we heard a beautiful slavery story about Onesimus.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to Philemon.
Yep. I haven't listened to Josh's full sermon yet, but I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, I mean, that's the story of how Paul deals with it, and Onesimus gets ripped off and probably taken advantage of, and now he's trying to restore this guy who's a slave, who's a brother in Christ, to his other brother, who's hosting the house church. So, all right, we're almost at the end here. Casuistic?
Say casual, but then
Casuistic. It's because I do see cause, even though there's no you. And it's kind of like, causal. But casuistic law is conditional, setting a particular standard under certain conditions. Certain conditions have to be met. Not everyone would own a slave or find themselves in that circumstances. So sometimes it is. But here's an important part for us to understand. Whether it's either one of these, apodictic or casuistic law, they're both paradigmatic. Paradigmatic. Another big one. What that means is you think of you think of like paradigm or something like this, or alongside when we talked about parables, right? It means that these things were given to establish, they were examples of a principle. The law seeks to establish principles by providing specific examples, but those examples are not meant to be exhaustive. So when he's talking about, if you have the field of grapes, like in our previous verse, he's not saying if you have livestock or you grow something else, you can just ignore the poor. God is just using a specific example to set up a paradigm of this is how you generally function. And so understanding of the law about that is helpful, in which is a lot of reasons why Jesus was indicting the Pharisees for neglecting the law. They did not accept this paradigmatic thing that was patently obvious, that it's not as if God was saying let's go back even to here, right? at the bottom there, the wages of the hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. It's not as if God is saying, if you cheat them out of their wages and you make them stay there all night until the moment the sun comes up, you're doing right. Still, you're technically obeying the law. Like, you're still cheating this person what you owe them. It's supposed to be paradigmatic. You pay them what you owe them when you owe it. And this expression of it shall not remain with you until night in the morning, it's paradigmatic. Don't delay in paying them what you owe when you have it. And don't lie to them about paying them what they owe. And so understanding that dynamic helps us understand a lot of Jesus wrestling with the people, with the Sabbath day, these things. It's like God gives them specific examples. You shall not collect wood. You shall not do this. It's paradigmatic. Just don't do any hard work. You can trust in God's provisions for you on this Sabbath day. Take it as a time. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It was meant to be a blessing for you, so you don't have to work hard. But to Jesus' point in the New Testament, yes, you could do good on the Sabbath, even if it takes a little bit of hard work. Like he criticizes them. Which of you Pharisees who has a piece of livestock that falls into a ditch, you don't pull it out so you don't lose it. And you're here complaining because I healed this man's arm. He's been crippled his whole life. So, yeah. Sean, I think you're going to say something. Or
Just to the concept of paradigmatic, it's like, it's not exhaustive what he exactly says in the words, but it's the spirit behind the law.
Yeah.
And that's what Paul tells us, is like, we should serve in the newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter.
Yeah.
Like, don't look at just the letter like it says Zatar, but what's the spirit behind it? Like you said, don't cheat someone out of what you owe them.
Yeah. And God does that through the specific examples that he gives. So just know it's not exhaustive. And even in our nation, we do this now. Remember, ancient Near Eastern people, some had papyrus, other things. People handwriting things. Can you imagine trying to write like U.S. legal code on stone and different things like, and even our law, right? We have, first of all, like the Constitution, which is more like the Apodictic law of like, here's just universal principles for everyone, everywhere. But then there's case law and things we study. But even now, in the U.S. legal code, not every single circumstance that could ever happen is give an example. And that's why in real court cases, they look at other court cases as precedents for how to decide on a case, because it's just almost impossible for humans, literally, like all the dumb and wrong things people could do, we'll never have a list big enough. So it makes sense as God gives them these things. He's going to give it examples that are specific but aren't meant to be exhaustive, because otherwise these books of the law will be a whole lot longer. I don't know if you've ever seen legal code books from law students, but you put it up, the pages are as big as this podium, and they're this big, there are tons of volumes of them, and it still can't even cover everything. So, but I think it's important for us to realize that it's not meant to cover every circumstance. And Jesus often points that out in his indictment of sort of the religious establishment of like, of saying, he tells the people, do what the Pharisees teach you, but just don't do exactly what they do. Because there's some sense in which Jesus says to the Pharisees, look, you do the small things. You tithe dill and mint and cumin and all these little tithes, but then you neglect weightier matters like justice and mercy, which is because the law is paradigmatic, that you're supposed to show mercy on people who are poor or handicapped. You're supposed to show, you're supposed to give justice to the widow, to the fatherless, to these people, and that they don't. So it's just good for us to know. And as you read those law, know it. So that's all I got for today. The Old Testament law is significant. I think it, like I said, again, it exposes our sin. It teaches us something about the character of God. I think there is some carryover between the laws. It tells us something about how God has related to his people, and we're not entirely free from the Old Testament law, in the sense that that's what convicted us of our sin and even continues to show us how we're unrighteous and our need of Christ. But also there's even a new law under Christ that we obey as we've come to trust in him.